Hey guys, this is your host Eric. Today we are going to watch action genre movie called Castle Fall. Spoilers ahead, turn on your subtitle, I greatly appreciate your support. Enjoy the video. Watch out for spoilers and take precautions. Castle Falls begins by introducing Mike, a legendary MMA fighter. Mike, on the other hand, rarely fought anymore because he was no longer young and had suffered a severe shoulder injury. Mike met his former manager one day and asked him to return him to the battlefield. But his former manager said he couldn't because of his age and a fairly severe shoulder injury. As a result, he recently suffered 3 consecutive defeats in his most recent fight. However, Mike continues to insist on asking his former manager to assist him in fighting back because he desperately needs it right now. Because his former manager continues to refuse to return him to the battlefield, Mike attempts to persuade him by challenging one of the fighters present. Mike had initially mastered the fight. However, Mike begins to tire, which allows his opponent to corner him and eventually defeat the once legendary MMA fighter. After this defeat, Mike begins to accept that he is no longer a great fighter who fights in high-level combat. He is now bankrupt and has been evicted from his apartment because he cannot pay the rent. He then handed him his boxing gloves, indicating that he had decided to retire as a fighter and that he was trying to move on with his life by looking for another job to make ends meet. Mike is then hired as a construction worker on the Castle High Hospital eviction project. The scene then shifts to a middle-aged man named Richard, who lives with his daughter Emily and is sick in bed. Emily has leukemia, which necessitates significant medical expenses. Soon after, a woman approached Richard and took Emily's care while she was being treated at home. However, Richard did not yet have the funds to cover the fees. He then received a call from the hospital informing him that Emily would need to go through chemotherapy again. But first, they demanded $400,000 in medical expenses due to the health insurance he had exhausted for previous medical expenses. Richard appeared to be frustrated with his current situation and wondered where he would get the money to pay for Emily's treatment. The action shifts to a federal prison, where a black inmate named Lando is arguing with another inmate named Damien. They got into a fight after he inquired about the location of some money hidden by Lando. When Damien and his henchmen ganged up on land, a warden remained silent. The scene then returns to Mike, who appears to be daydreaming about his fate, which has shifted from legendary MMA fighter to low-wage construction worker. Mike's boss reprimanded him and told him he needed to focus more on his work because they had a deadline before Castle High was demolished. On the other hand, it appears that the mayor is telling reporters that the Castle High Hospital will be demolished the day after tomorrow and the land will be used to build a new sports complex. Lando, who was watching television in his detention cell at the time, appeared surprised to learn that Castle High Hospital was about to be evicted. Lando then requested to meet with the chief warden, who happened to be none other than Richard. Without further ado, Lando requested that Richard be transferred to the southern prison block immediately, while also offering him money to help pay for his daughter's treatment. But when Lando mentioned Emily's situation, Richard became enraged and hit him. The next morning, Richard went to Lando in secret and inquired about the money because he desperately needed it. Lando then reveals that he once robbed Damien of $3 million and hidden the money in the Castle High Hospital, which was about to be demolished. Lando stated that he did not want the money and instead wanted to assist Richard in obtaining funds to pay for his daughter's treatment. Lando only requested that Richard relocate to the South Block because he was constantly bullied by Damien and his henchmen if he remained here. Richard then accepted the offer. Warden, on the other hand, turned out to be on Damien's side and informed him that Richard would relocate Lando to the South Block so that Damien and his henchmen would no longer bother him. Hearing this, Damien assumed Lando had asked Richard to take the booty money hidden by the man. Damien then called his brother Deacon and asked him to handle the situation because Richard required a large sum of money. Damien is a drug lord, and Deacon now runs his drug business while Damien is in prison. During a break, Mike appeared to be casually chatting with one of the workers named George, who stated that he did not want to work as a construction worker with low pay. George, on the other hand, had no choice, especially since he was already married with 2 children. Mike then revealed that he was an MMA fighter in the past, but now he's bankrupt and has to work any job to make ends meet. George then realized Mike was an MMA fighter, and his 2 children had become his fans because he was homeless. Mike is stranded in a car near the Castle High Hospital building for the night. Deacon and his wife Kat, on the other hand, appeared to be monitoring the hospital building that will be demolished and intending to infiltrate there. When all of the construction workers have left the site, while moving things, George tells Mike that he wants to move to Alaska with his family and then invites him to do so. Mike was cleaning another room alone when he discovered a bag containing a large sum of money, which was none other than the loot that Lando had hidden before being thrown into prison because their working hours had expired. George then told Mike to get out of there right away. Mike kept the money a secret from George and simply took $10 and hid it. He intended to retrieve the money containing bag after everyone had left. Elsewhere, Deacon is preparing his henchmen to infiltrate the Castle High Hospital building in anticipation of Richard's arrival, having been informed by Lando of the location of the money. To avoid suspicion, Deacon and his men would disguise themselves as construction workers. Meanwhile, Richard was making plans to visit Castle High and collect the money. Before you leave, Richard kissed his daughter goodbye and explained that he had urgent work to complete. Meanwhile, Mike, who was waiting in line with George for a beer, informed his companion that he had left his jacket at the construction site and would have to return. He then handed over the $10 bill he had taken and rushed out of there. Mike then enters the Castle High Hospital building, which will be demolished soon to make way for the money. Mike was overjoyed to discover that the money remained where he had hidden it, instead of going right away. He took the time to count the money, believing that no one would notice. Richard, on the other hand, appeared to have entered the Castle High building, but one of Deacon's men noticed his presence and immediately informed his boss. Unexpectedly, a construction worker was assigned to stand guard until the time for the eviction arrived not long after Deacon and his men entered the construction site through the left side of the building. Kat killed the construction worker without thinking to avoid interfering with their work. Meanwhile, Richard appeared to be making his way to the 6th floor. According to Lando's previous instructions, he noticed a pile of explosives that would be used to demolish the structure in 4 hours. Deacon and his men were also spotted entering the structure. After arming themselves, they dispersed throughout the building in search of Richard. Mike, on the other hand, had noticed Richard's presence in the next room. Then he hurriedly returned the money to his bag and left. Mike was about to descend the stairs when he noticed Deacon's men ascending. Mike had returned to the scene. Richard discovered a note scattered on the floor and realized that the money had been found and taken. At the same time, he heard metal clanging, which was caused by Mike inadvertently kicking an iron. Richard, however, was not the only one who heard this. Deacon and his men heard it as well and rushed towards the source, thinking it was Richard, knowing that someone else was also looking for the money. Mike went into hiding immediately after seeing Richard, who was also hiding from Deacon and his gang. The appearance of a man who had infiltrated the hospital building, none other than George, who was looking for Mike's whereabouts because he had not returned, diverted Deacon and his men's attention. Kat inadvertently discovers a bag of money in George's pocket and believes George is the one who stole it. Deacon and his gang tortured George and forced him to reveal the location of the money. Mike, who saw this from his hiding place and knew nothing about the money, couldn't help George because George never gave him the information he needed. Deacon then directed his men to murder him. Knowing that George has been murdered, Mike inadvertently reveals his location to Deacon and his friends. Deacon gave his men the order to arrest Mike. Mike, on the other hand, appears to be deeply troubled by George's death and decides to avenge his death after concealing the money. Before Kat and his gang cornered Mike, he dropped several of Deacon's men. Mike, on the other hand, manages to escape from Kat and his henchmen via the garbage can. However, Richard was already present and was quickly apprehended. Richard then threatens Mike with a knife and forces him to reveal the location of Mike, on the other hand, claims to be a construction worker who knows nothing about money. Mike then attacked Richard, catching him off guard, and the two got into a fierce fight before being stopped by one of Deacon's henchmen, who threatened the two at gunpoint. Mike and Richard tried to calm him down and caught him off guard, allowing Mike to immobilize him. However, as the rest of the Deacon's men arrived, Mike and Richard were forced to flee. Deacon then orders his men to barricade the entrances and exits of the building and attempts to strike a deal with Mike in which Mike gives up the money in exchange for Deacon keeping him alive. But, of course, Mike turned down the offer and chose to fight Deacon's men. Mike, who was trapped inside the building by Deacon's men, then jumped out the window while hanging from the thick curtains. But, as Deacon and his henchmen continue to shoot at him from below, he attempts to return inside the building, where he is confronted by Kat, who is pointing a gun at him. Fortunately, Richard appeared and struck Kat, pushing her body against them. Thinking the person by the window was Mike Deacon, his men continued to shoot at him until they realized it was Kat. Deacon is heartbroken to see his wife, who died horribly after falling from a height, and vows to let Mike and Richard escape alive. Richard, on the other hand, treated Mike's injured arm before asking him about money, but Mike still claims that he is just a construction worker and knows nothing about money. Mike and Richard confront the Deacon's men once more, but this time they both kill them all. Mike then pointed a gun at Richard, believing that he was a member of the Deacon gang. But Richard quickly denied it, explaining that he was forced to do all of this because he no longer had enough money to treat his daughter. Mike began to believe Richard's words. He then instructed Deacon via walkie-talkie to come upstairs and collect the money in person. Mike then took the money he had hidden and gave it to Richard. Richard then invites Mike to leave the building right away. However, given that the Castle High building is about to be demolished, Mike intends to slaughter Deacon and his henchmen in order to avenge George's death. Richard also assures Mike that the explosion will kill Deacon and his men. He eventually gave up and planned to flee with Richard after much thought. The mayor, on the other hand, and the other construction workers were preparing to demolish the Castle High building in 15 days. Deacon and one of his remaining men then pursue Mike and Richard, who attempted to flee through the building's roof, where they engage in a firefight, causing Mike to be restrained and hide in order to avoid Deacon's attack. Mike then asked Richard to go first, leaving him alone to fight Deacon. Deacon then ordered his men to come down and stand guard at the building's exit to prevent Richard from fleeing with the money. When Mike's ammunition runs out, he challenges Deacon to a close-range fight. Meanwhile, Richard killed the last remaining Deacon henchman and fled in their truck. Mike eventually defeated Deacon and dashed away with because Castle High will be demolished in a matter of minutes. While Deacon is still alive and trying to collect the money scattered on the roof, Mike is forced to jump into Richard's truck. The Castle High hospital building was finally demolished, as were Richard and Mike, who drove away from the collapsed structure. While Deacon's fate is unknown, and he may have been buried in the building that was destroyed a few days later, Mike gave George's family some money to help them deal with financial difficulties following his death. Following that, he follows George's advice and drives to Alaska. Meanwhile, Richard relocated Damien to the South Block, which was one of Land's requests because Hein planned to kill Damien there. This film depicts a father's struggle for the sake of his daughter's recovery. Richard is willing to go to any length to obtain funds for his ailing daughter's treatment. We really appreciate you watching. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel with the notification bell because it is really important for us. Thank you.